So this, as I said, is a continuation of our summer skills program, our camp that was so much fun and so informative. And we heard from a lot of you that you wanted to continue on with our conversation about anti-racism. And Trish Garner did this starting of that great program during the summer, and she has taken this on as a project that will happen over the next several months. So be watchful for the next session that will be in November, probably toward the end. And Trish is going to introduce our special guest, Markisha Smith. Trish.
All right. Well, before I introduce Dr. Smith, I just want to thank Pat and Nancy for helping me getting this going. And Nancy did a great job getting our logo together, and she's our Zoom guru. So what can I say? I just also want to thank all of you who have Zoomed in tonight. I wrote this and I don't know, hopefully it has some meaning to you. Together, we have committed ourselves to embark on a journey to learn and relearn about racism, and more importantly, to discover what action we need to take in order to become anti-racists. Tonight, we have the honor and pleasure to have Dr. Markisha Smith, who will speak to us about what needs to change. Dr. Smith previously served as a director for the Office of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion in the Oregon Department of Education. She's now, is it the City of Portland? I think you're with, yes? Her work is specifically focused on best practices regarding equity, diversity, and inclusion, culturally responsive practice, and closing opportunity, access, belief gaps for historically and currently marginalized groups across the state. She also served as a director of undergraduate teacher education at Warner Pacific College, was an assistant professor at Western Oregon University and Northern Michigan University. And in a task that I would never want to take on, she was a high school English teacher in Houston for 9 years. In short, in case you guys haven't picked this up, she knows what she is talking about. And just to warn you, we got our signals crossed a little bit, and she was like thinking this was going to be a preparation session. So she has zoomed to the rescue. Although we may occasionally see or hear one or two of her, I believe, beautiful children, Cadence and Bryson. So anyway, we're truly most pleased to have you here. Dr. Smith, you are on.
Thank you so much. And my apologies again. I have something ready, and so that's a wonderful thing. And so I just went in and was able to change the date, and here we go. So presentation that I've given a couple of times now, and it's really around how do we dismantle systemic oppression and think about how white supremacy works in local government. And so it's been one that I think is resonating with folks because it's sort of defining some of the ways in which white supremacy shows up. And then how do we think about combating that, right? How do we think about what do we do in our work every day to really challenge that so that we're doing something different? And so just to kind of give you a heads up about what I'll be sharing. And so I'm going to pull up my presentation, and hopefully everyone can see this okay. If you could give me a thumbs up, that'd be great. Yes. And let me know. Okay, very good. So in my introduction, yes, work for the City of Portland. I have been there since February of last year. So I was celebrating my 1-year anniversary right before the pandemic hit. And then everything got real interesting over the last few months, as we all know. So it's really important to me to ground myself whenever I'm having these discussions. And, there's a lot that we could, sort of be thinking about that's sort of grounding us or making us rethink what our purpose is in the work. And so for me, it's been really this summer thinking about the lives lost, right? Thinking about how our protests have been situated. We've got an impending election next week. I've been in conversations with folks at the city level about all that that means, and staff who are afraid, right, both for their personal and their professional well-being. And so I put Breonna Taylor's picture here because this is an example of, and I think very, very resonant here. We had, the murder of George Floyd and the outcry about that, and just really sort of questioning policing in this country, right? It wasn't anything new that happened, right? But I think it was the first time that there was this sort of public outcry, right, around how policing was happening in our country. And then in the midst of that, we've had women, right? Women of color. And in this case, Breonna Taylor, a young Black woman who have also been victims of police brutality. And although some would say that, justice was served in her case, others I think would disagree, right? Sort of based on the circumstances that we're hearing about and reading about. And so I just want to, sort of bring her into the space and bring that narrative into the space as we're thinking about how our systems work, right? So just thinking about Breonna Taylor and the pain and trauma that, her friends, family, and community, and I would say the larger Black community are experiencing as a result of her death and so many others. The other thing that I'm going to share with you is also, and I put this in the presentation when I did it the last time because it was something that just happened about, maybe a month ago now. And I put it here because I want folks to understand how real this fight is. And I know as a public official that there are things that I say and that I do that people are going to disagree with. And so I have sort of kind of put an armor on, if you will, to prepare for that. And then I, over the course of maybe a couple of days, started to get a slew of hate email based on an op-ed piece that I had released, like I said, about a month ago. And so I'm going to share with you the first email that came in from that op-ed piece, because I think it's another, for me, sort of way in which I'm grounding myself and a reminder about why I'm doing this work and why I'm talking to people about this work and the work that they need to do, right? So it's a trigger warning. I'm going to give you that right now. It's not very nice. I'm okay. I'm working through it, but I just want you to, sort of think about that. And I'm not going to read it. I'll just put it up for a couple of seconds, look at it, and then, we can move on. Hey, yo, bloody food was good. I'm in the hood. I have a hood. So we'll move on from this. And I can tell by folks' facial expressions, you don't have to say anything, right? That this is a lot. And I think, again, for me, like I was hurt, right? You see this, I was hurt, right? It's sort of like a gut punch, right? And I thought to myself, could my words, right? And what I'm representing in the work that I'm doing really cause such a visceral reaction in someone that it would make them write these words. And it's the interesting thing is I was talking about how often we've been using our First Amendment rights to support hate speech. And then lo and behold, case in point. And so again, it's grounding myself, reminding me why I'm doing this work and why I'm talking to folks about the work that they need to do and the work that is happening. And like, this is real, right? These are the real enemies that we face in the work that we do. So quickly, a few things that I hope that we can achieve in my time with you today. And I have until, is it 8 o'clock? I want to make sure I'm good. Is that right? Ish. Okay, I want to leave time for questions. So we want to think about how white supremacy impacts government structures. And I would just venture to say, not just government structures, but just structures in general. I'm focusing there just because of the work that I've been doing previous and now. We want to think about ways that we can disrupt systems of oppression, and how do we really create systems that are equitable and just. And I may not have all the answers for you, right, in this presentation tonight, but I want you to be thinking about some things, ways in which you personally can, in the work that you may be doing, can interrupt systemic oppression. And then finally, we want to think about how do we commit to centering the voices and the experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We're being very intentional now about how we are naming the communities that have been historically and currently disparate treatment, right, have been impacted the most by systemic oppression. And so we want to make sure that we're committing, which is why I bring Breonna Taylor into the space, right, and say all these sort of narratives that I think help to ground us. So if you are familiar with the work of Tima Okun and white supremacy culture, some of this may be familiar to you, but just to kind of give us a sense of what do we mean when we say culture, right? Because I think any of you have been in a space or a time where you have sort of adapted to or realized that there was a culture to what was happening, right? Maybe you left one job and went to another, right? And you noticed that the culture was different. In this sense, we're really talking about culture as knowledge, beliefs, or attitudes, all of these things that really a group of people take on and really sort of use and adopt and, you know, sort of fit into their way of life. Culture can also be about communication, right? We think about, you know, how we talk verbally, non-verbally, right? All of those pieces can be a cultural component. Our proximity to one another, right? All of that sort of feeds into our cultural understanding. And then this whole piece in this third bullet around how culture is often passed through communication. And I would also say from one generation to the next, right? So you sort of learn and, you know, have a way of being and operating in the world based on the things that you learn from your ancestors or from the folks who have been here before you. And then we could also think about culture as collective programming of the mind, right? That really sort of distinguishes who's a part of our culture and who's not, right? So sort of a way to categorize people, right? Or to group people. And so all of this makes up culture. So if we think about these components and then we put in front of this white supremacy culture, really what we're talking about is how is the current culture in which we operate, how does it have its foundation, right? What are the knowledge, experiences, beliefs, values, and attitudes about living in a culture where the way of life, the way of knowing and being is based in this idea of white supremacy, right? One group having superiority over others. Okay, so just kind of making those connections together. Okay, so thinking about culture. If you can see this, and hopefully you can, I think this is a really good illustration of what we mean by overt versus covert white supremacy. And so a lot of time, I think we're seeing a little bit of everything right now, right? Obviously what I showed to you when I first got started here in terms of that email, that was overt, right? Very in your face, right? No questions asked. We know exactly what the person is trying to communicate there. So often, you know, we say those are socially unacceptable. How dare they, right? We get outraged when these sorts of things happen. It's the things that are below the line that we really have to think about. So what are the covert ways in which white supremacy culture shows up? And so you can see some of the phrases here, right? Some of the things that for us are almost a lot of times socially acceptable. And I should say, we just don't say much about them, or we just don't do much about them, or we find excuses for them. And I think all of this is sort of rising now above the surface as we're thinking about what's going on with policing and with our social political environment, like all of that. But for so long, right? And I think for so many generations, we haven't really thought about what's sort of churning here below the surface, right? And how have we been accepting of, right? How have we sort of denied that this might be harmful, right? Or that this might be causing trauma to particular communities in our world, right? Does that make sense for everyone, right? So, and if you look at that list, right, I think in all sorts of ways, there may have been things that you've seen or participated in, right? You've witnessed, like all of this has happened, and we haven't really thought about it, right? I would say microaggressions probably could go below the line here, right? Some of these are sort of microaggression type of language. So all of that. Okay, so we want to think about how does the line now is sort of getting blurred between what is overt and what is covert. And we've got to think about like none of this being socially acceptable, right? Just not okay. And how are we having conversations about how to change that? Okay, so we'll keep going. So I'm going to talk through these pretty quickly because I want to make sure we have time for questions. But Timo Kuhn in the white supremacy culture research and work talk about these particular characteristics of white supremacy culture. And these are not probably the only, right, that we could identify as we think about how we operate and sort of do our thing every day. But these are the ones that often show up in our organizations. And so culture is powerful precisely because it is so present and at the same time so very difficult to name or identify. The characteristics listed on this slide, and I'll, like I said, kind of talk about each of them in subsequent slides, can be damaging because they are used as norms and standards without being proactively named or chosen by the group, right? Like you just sort of have to adapt to them, right? Make it work. They're also damaging because they promote white supremacy thinking. Because we all live in a white supremacy culture, these characteristics show up in the attitudes and behaviors of all of us. So people of color as well, right, are not, exempt from what we see here. And I'm sitting before you today with a doctorate degree. And so there has to have been some ways in which I've adopted white supremacy cultural characteristics in order to navigate that. Now, I'm at the point in my career, in my life, where I recognize what's happened, and I'm, sort of fighting against that. But again, this is something that we all, because we go back to that definition around culture, like we've all been sort of entrenched in this culture that we navigate every day. So therefore, these attitudes and beliefs can show up in any group or organization, whether it's white-led or predominantly white, or people of color-led and predominantly people of color our staff, right? So doesn't matter. Just want to kind of put that out there as well. So let's go through these pretty quickly. So the first is around perfectionism, right? And this is the idea that, mistakes are about the person rather than thinking about like what within the system or what within the process may not have been all that it could have been. And so we think about what's wrong instead of really about what's right. A lot of times this comes up in government because we'll say, well, the public's just not engaged. And it's like, well, how are we engaging them, right? And it is, when policy passes and, folks are all of a sudden upset, we'll say that, well, it was that community's fault because, right? So we make it about the person or the group rather than about what it really is about, right? And it's our process and the way in which we have thought through things. And so one way to sort of think about how do we fix this is we have to talk about what's going well. And we also have to think about a culture that is appreciative. How can we foster a culture of appreciation for folks, no matter what, right? No matter how they show up or no matter how they might be different, right? From something that is comfortable for us. And so how can we be an organization of learning rather than one that is just focused on right and wrong? The second characteristic is about this sense of urgency. I can raise my hand, right? Like I'm in the middle of that right now. We've got CARES Act funding that we got from the federal government. Some of you may be familiar with the CARES Act funding. And we've got until December 30th to spend this stuff. And it's like, we just really got money, right? But there's no time. We've got to sacrifice everything that we're doing so that we can get results that are quick, right? And we make these things that are unrealistic, right? These sort of unrealistic, arbitrary timelines sometimes that are made up that make it really difficult for us to slow down and think about who we're engaging in the process and who is this going to benefit. And I'm happy to say that we were able to do a lot of that in the beginning stages of the CARES Act funding allocations. And we have been able to specifically target resources for Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. But now I've just, finished a meeting at 8 o'clock this morning where we're at a sense of urgency again, because we have funds left over And we're trying to think very quickly about what we're going to do with that. And so we've got to think about how are we being realistic and how are we slowing down, right? And so feds have put this timeline on us, and now everything's in a rush, right? We've got to go at lightning speed to try and do things. And we can't really, as this says, learn from any of our past experiences. We don't have the opportunity to do that. The third characteristic is around defensiveness. And so the issues are we often want to protect power, protect feelings. Folks can't say what it is that they're really thinking or feeling because we're afraid of hurting someone's feelings, or someone's going to accuse us of X, Y, or Z. And so we have to understand what is the link between defensiveness and fear. Okay, so kind of think about that. Am I defensive about something that someone has said because I'm fearful that something's going to be taken away from me, or something's going to change, right, in the way in which I have to process or sort of operate or do my business? And we have to really start to name defensiveness as the problem, okay? And I've experienced this kind of in my work where I'll bring up the fact that, a program or a service is not serving people of color in the community. And someone will say that I've told them that they're racist. And I'm like, how do we get from your program isn't working for people of color to me saying that you're racist? Like, what's the link? And really, it's about fear, right? There's something in that they feel like is going to be taken away from them. And really, we're just thinking about how are we centering communities that we've never centered before, that our systems were never designed to center. That's really the conversation. So we have to think about how does, and defensiveness can also get us off track, right? So it's another sort of detour that we can take that keeps us from really focusing in on what we need to focus in on, right? And serving our communities. Quantity over quality, right? So how much can we do? Rather thinking about what's the value of what we're doing, right? How do we also value the process that's happening? How do we get off of an agenda, right? And really think about who's engaged. And so a lot of our initiatives, it's like, how much money can we carve out of like this little drop in the bucket? Often it's never enough money. I think all of us could probably nod our heads and say that for the need that's out there. So, we have this conversation about how many ways can we slice this pie? And are those ways really quality? Are those ways making a difference in our community? Are those ways anti-racist, right? Are we just perpetuating the same sorts of things that we always do? Okay, so thinking about how we get away from that and really start to think about the value and the quality of what we do. There's this piece around the worship of the written word. And so if it's not an email or if it's not written down somewhere, we don't have value for that. And some of you kind of laughing. I see people smiling. And so we don't think about, and I use this example, that the US is a very individualistic society, right? It's sort of like, you do your thing and you take care of self, right? And just your immediate, whoever's around you. And a lot of communities of color, they are collectivist societies. And so often in collectivist societies, we're talking and communicating. A lot of that is nonverbal. A lot of that is in, varied ways. And so it may not get written, but we're hearing stories. We're hearing, live narrative from community telling us that this isn't working. And we don't value that in the same way that we do the community member that has something nice and neat and typed in a memo on letterhead, right? And, can come to city council and present it, right? And that we value over the lived experience of folks who are really just struggling every day, right? Who are sitting at home right now thinking about how am I going to have, food for my family tomorrow? Like how is this resource going to get met? And so we have to think about how we recognize the skills that everyone brings to the table. And we have to really be about the fact that everything doesn't need to be written, right? That there are other ways in which we can communicate and get to know folks and to understand their narratives without this being the only way in which we do business. But again, white supremacy culture would tell us that this is what we value, right? Only one right way. Okay, so kind of a similar narrative, right? You either learn the right way to do things and adopt it, or if you don't, that's a problem, right? And again, kind of going back to there's something wrong with the individual and our perfectionism characteristic. And so we have to have this acceptance of a variety of ways to achieve a goal. and thinking about, that you need to understand and value community ways of knowing, doing, and being. And so there's not just one right way to do things. There are many different ways to collectively work towards a goal. And so I've been learning this in a procurement process, right? We have a lot of what I think are just sort of unnecessary barriers, like self-created barriers to doing what we need to do, to putting resources in community. And instead of questioning that, we just ask everybody to do it this way, to fill it out this way if you want to get some support. And that's not okay, right? So how do we really think about other ways of doing things that may make us uncomfortable, right, from the other side, but are really about creating this anti-racist, equitable opportunity and environment for the people that live in our community. Paternalism. So this funny little cartoon here. And so often we have these siloed decision-making processes, right? It's just kind of, you don't know who's making the decision. You just know it's not you. And those in power don't think it's important, right, to really understand who it is that they're making decisions for, right? You're telling me that this is what my community needs, but you haven't asked me anything about it. And so how do we know that, that's okay? How do we know that works? And so we're not really clear about who's making decisions and how those decisions are being vetted. And so these are ways that we can fix issues of paternalism and white supremacist culture, is to really be transparent, right? To think about who has authority and responsibility, and how are we not just having Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, we'll say, well, we invited them, right? But what does that really mean, right? There's a difference between being authentically included, between, you being the creator of something for your community versus someone else creating that and telling you what it is that you need. Those are very distinct differences. And so this is where we have to sort of think about, how are we engaging community? Either or thinking, this kind of goes back to that right, wrong, right, good, bad, linked to perfectionism. Again, slowing down, analyzing, thinking about how we call out simplification of complex issues. Sometimes we, like I said, we make things difficult that don't have to be. I remember we were trying to do some food support programming for communities of color at the beginning of COVID. And it just seemed like all this unnecessary paperwork. Like, folks need food, right? Folks are suffering. And so why are we making them fill this out to tell us how much income they earn? Obviously not enough if they need food, right? Or if they've lost their job. And so I think that is really an important part of how we need to think about, simplifying things, and we just make complex for no reason. Power hoarding, another thing to think about, kind of going back to that paternalism piece. We don't know where power is coming from often. Well, we know, but we don't want to acknowledge that. We're very, clandestine about that. But then we also don't have a lot of value in sharing power. And we have this assumption that people that are in powerful positions know what's best for everybody. So not true. So we have to think about, what does leadership look like? How do we focus on mission and values? How are we developing ways to share power and skills with others? And thinking about, as we're developing programs, how are we doing that with community, right? At the center. Fear of conflict. This kind of goes back to that piece around being defensive, right? So we fear or ignore emotion. We want to be polite, right? Rather than really just having folks face the challenges that they're having in certain situations. That is often a detour. And so there'll be folks crying. I've been in meetings, we're talking, and all of a sudden, it becomes a sort of a spotlight on someone and sort of the emotional response that they're going through about something. And it becomes sort of this, it's this detour, this distraction. And then all of a sudden we're not even talking about the topic at hand, which was maybe, getting food to Black and brown communities, right? How do we get here? I'll give you a prime example. And I use it because I think it's one that, I've been thinking about since I saw it happen, and it happened last year. And so in council last year, there was a woman that had come to testify, white woman that came to testify, and it was around something that had to do with housing. And Commissioner Hardesty, if you all know anything about Portland, City of Portland, she's the only African-American woman right now that sits on city council. And she had questions, and, Commissioner Hardesty comes with hard questions sometimes, but this was a really simple question, something around the nature of, like, how is the programming that you're talking about, how is it benefiting, Black and Indigenous people of color communities? Basically, like, what's the benefit here? And the woman started crying, and Commissioner Hardesty was confused. She didn't say it, and I've listened to the tape. It wasn't, with any sense of like animosity, but the woman wasn't answering the question, and so I guess she just got caught up in that. And then the mayor just sort of turns and he berates Commissioner Hardesty in front of everyone and says, "We don't treat our guests like that." And I'm like, question never got answered. Is this something we're going to vote on? How does the program serve people of color? So that's an example of how we could take a detour, right? And I watched that sort of play out, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is like right here, right? This open conflict thing. So we don't need to have a prescribed way for the way in which issues need to be raised, and we have to suspend judgment. And I will say too, like, there are times where folks get emotional about the things that they're sharing. So this can work the opposite way, especially from communities that have been steeped in trauma. And so sometimes that's not, that's seen as weakness, or that's seen as, they're being overly emotional, and, we really can't, we don't really know what it is that they're asking for. And so that can kind of work two ways, right? Both as a distraction and also as an emotional response to the trauma that people have experienced, right? That looks very different depending on how you've navigated the world, right? So that conflict piece. Individualism, again, I kind of touched on this, individual societies versus collectivist societies, and a lot of, not all of, and not just, I won't say everyone's a monolith, generally speaking, a lot of communities of color are collectivist in nature. And so it's around this teamwork, and there's a value beyond just me, right? So my work is not just about Markisha, right? It's about the larger community that I serve. That's very important to me. So the things that I'm doing and saying and thinking about, I'm not thinking just serve me and my family, right? My two children and my mother, right? It's a wide community, right? And so I think that's very different. And a lot of times, again, in white supremacist culture, it's like an individual credit or recognition rather than thinking about how does this work as a collective, right? Or as a team. I'm the only one, kind of goes back to that only one way to do things, connected to individualism. If something has to be done, I've got to do it, right? Not thinking about how we can share responsibility, and not thinking about how we can evaluate the work that's being done based on the collective, right? So again, that kind of power hoarding that I've mentioned before. And so yes, these puppies are adorable. I wouldn't want to take care of all of them. I got 2 kids and a bird that I can barely manage. But sometimes, this idea in white supremacist culture that progress is, is bigger, or it means more. And so that just means we need to have more programs, or we need to, more. And we're not really thinking about, again, the process. We're also not thinking about how do our actions, affect generations past, present, and future. Like, what is is having more really what we need? Or, is expansion here really what we need? Or do we need to slow down and think about how can we make this quality? It's kind of like the quality over quantity piece. How can this be a quality program, right? How can this be something that's sustainable, that really is anti-racist in nature, right? That really is, pushing against systems of white supremacy. And that's very different, right? So objectivity. And so often on issues of race in particular, folks like to say, that they're neutral, right? Or having emotions about something is irrational or can be destructive. And so we don't really, we don't want to have those conversations. Having conversations about race and having conversations about how to be an anti-racist organization or city or nation or world, like that's uncomfortable. And often that means we have to hear from folks who have experienced racism, right? Because they have been uncomfortable since their existence in this world. And we don't want to do that. So we'd rather just say, we're neutral. We'd rather just say, well, I don't see color, right? I don't see race. And if folks are, sharing their experiences, their traumatic experiences, we think that's irrational, right? That doesn't make sense. How could they feel this way, right? We do things with equality in mind. And there's a difference between equity and equality, right? And we often think that giving everyone the same thing means that everybody should be happy, right? And so there should be no one that is, upset about, right? And, Brown versus Board of Education, prime example of how equality doesn't quite cut it. So I think we just have to, really be thinking about how do we engage with individuals who have vast perspectives and views, and how are we also able to sort of sit in some of this discomfort as we hear folks express what has been their experience, particularly with race in this country. Here again, we've kind of talked about this one, right to comfort, right? Who do we comfort, right, in times of distress, and how do we comfort? What is, sort of this connection between those folks in power, having the right to emotional and psychological comfort, and, others not, right? And so thinking about, again, discomfort is sort of this route for learning. We have to sort of sit in the yucky, I often tell people, and often there's something that's happening or sort of stirring in us that's going to hopefully get us to a different and a deeper understanding of where we are. And I would also say here, just kind of, your political knowledge and your analysis of white supremacy, racism, systemic oppression is another way to really sort of think about where your comfort is, okay? So I have one other little piece that I want to share with you, but I want to pause there for just a moment. And I know there's been some things happening in the chat. And so if there are questions, I'm going to pause there. I've got a little bit more to share, but I'm going to wait to the end and do that. It's just a couple slides. So I want to pause for questions.
Wow. I'm Trish Garner. I'm glad we're recording this because I'm looking forward to taking a look at those slides and thinking about them. One of the slides you had, I think it was overt, covert. It was, it's kind of like a pyramid and so on. Could you just, I don't know, pick out a couple of examples there? And, I don't know, never own slave, don't blame me, never own slave, treating kids of color as adults. Hi, kids.
I'm presenting, baby. Shh. Okay, go ahead. Sorry. So sorry.
That is not to worry about. I don't know, English only initiatives, self-appointed white ally. What could you just take maybe the ones I just mentioned or others and just say, this is what I mean by that. And particularly, what is AAVE? But
and let me move. I got it. All your little pictures are right over some of the words. Okay, had to move the box over. I'll take the one, you said one around, don't blame me, I never owned slaves. And so often what that will, I've had someone say that to me as we were doing some equity training, right, in my previous job. And so that as a response to a conversation around how we are trying to build an anti-racist organization, that's not the response, right? And so, but we will say that, it's okay that they said that, right? Or it's okay that that's a way in which now they're choosing to disengage, because that's really what's happening, right? I get the privilege of not being able to, or get the privilege of not engaging this conversation. And I can use this as an excuse not to do that, right? I'm not to blame, right? This isn't my fault. And we just sort of accept that. Because again, it's around kind of protecting people's feelings. So we don't want to push them. Okay. And we just, again, say that's socially acceptable. Maybe that's where they are, right? We sort of say, well, Maybe they need a little bit more learning, or they're kind of struggling with that. So we just sort of excuse those kind of comments away. It's the same as you don't sound Black, or you're so articulate, which are very micro. Those are very, well, I say kind of overt microaggressions, but that's a microaggression, right? I've been told I'm so articulate. Well, so what does that really mean, right? So you're saying that other Black people aren't, right? So if you really sort of think about that, but again, that's kind of a socially acceptable. People often think it's just polite. Someone's giving me a compliment. We don't think about that at the deeper level for what that really is saying. Yeah, go ahead, Trish. I was trying to look at another one that you were saying.
No. That's fine. That's fine. Self-appointed white ally. What do you mean by that?
So I think it is, and this is another way I think that sometimes folks sort of get off the hook from doing the real work. So this will be maybe that allyship that looks like, well, I have a group of Black friends, or I eat at Black restaurants, all of which is good, right? Those are great things. And is that really allyship? So allyship, and we like to even say in the work now, co-conspirators. I need co-conspirators. So I need folks with me that are disrupting the system. And that's a different kind of ally. That's not just somebody that comes to my restaurant and eats. That's someone that says, I sit in a position of power, and I know that. And so I'm going to use that to think about how I can solicit change, right? Or change the way of doing something that's going to benefit a community that has never had a benefit from that before. And that's very different. That's like allyship, right? Those are the folks that are going in the trenches. And I think that, that self-appointed, well, doesn't that make me an ally that I have a few Black friends? And I would say, I don't know if that's really allyship in the sense that we talk about it in the work of, anti-racism or equity. So hopefully that makes sense, Trish.
Yep. How about, but we're all one big human family. There's only one human race after all.
True. And a long time ago, before any of us were here, folks, race is a socially constructed concept. And so it has been used to categorize people. And that's the reality, right? Yes, we are all human, and race has been used as a social construct to place a hierarchy on certain people over others. It's used as a justification for slavery. But we'll say, that sort of tugs at the heartstrings. Well, can we just, we all have a heart, and we all have a yes, and, how have other people, depending on what they're, how they have been categorized in this country, been treated? So.
How about spiritual bypassing?
So this one, and I don't always define it really well, but it's sort of the use of religion. And but I want to see if I can pull up, I may not be able to do it because I would have to stop sharing my screen. I've got a good little link to it. And someone else might be able to pull it up and see if I can get on my phone.
And also you can, just send it to me and I'll make sure everybody.
Yes, please. Because there's a link that I have that describes it really well, but it's connected to religion and how that is often used as a way, like kind of a justification for some things. So anyway, I will send a link because I have a link that really explains it quite well.
Please tell me this is not the story of Noah when, Ham sees him and so on. Anyway.
It's not that. It says it's a tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved issues. So a lot of times, if that makes sense, right? And in this case, it's a way, and often a way that folks will get out of having tough conversations about racism, right? So we often could misuse some things in our spiritual or religious context for that.
Okay, so you and I have been engaging in a conversation, but it looks like other people may have questions as well. So I can't, Nancy, I think you're going to have to regulate the screen a bit. Because I can stop sharing if that's more helpful, so you can.
I'm fine. It's fine. I want, some people have been asking questions in chat, and I didn't do this at the beginning to ask them to put a Q in the front so that we could know it was a question. So I have a question. Linda O'Hara, you had a question earlier on, and I can't find it at the moment. Why don't you go ahead and ask your question and unmute yourself and ask your question?
If she can't, I've got the question here.
Oh, okay, go ahead, Trish. Go ahead and ask.
Oh, yeah, if you've got the question, go ahead. I just found how to unmute. So go ahead.
It's a good one. Do you think, Dr. Smith, that a simple first step is to call people out when they see something happening? Not all circumstances may warrant doing that, you know, your safety. So I would like you, Dr. Smith, to comment on that aspect. When would it not be good to speak up? Or should we always speak up? Otherwise, we won't make any progress. So when do we speak up? When do we not speaking up move us forward? But maybe that's sometimes not socially appropriate or acceptable.
Yeah.
So
I think, like, obviously, if it's a matter of your safety, like your personal safety, I'm never saying like somebody put themselves in a situation where, you know, you've got someone with a weapon or something like this, and, you know, they may be spewing these, you know, these racist things, and you want to, like, that's a situation you need to gauge, right? And exercise some wise judgment there. I will say what I often, it's little things. And so sometimes you might be in a meeting, right? And you hear someone say something, and this has happened to me many times. I've been in spaces where I've made a comment, and there'll be another colleague, white colleague, you know, male or female, that will say the same thing. And you would never know that I said it, right? And it's not about me wanting accolades or somebody to sit in the middle of the meeting and clap for me because of what I said. It's just a matter of whoever the other person is that says it. Like, now it's like, yes, that's what we're going to do, right? Now it had to come from, and so those are the moments. And you're shaking your head because you have been in space, and I think even for women, right? Just even collectively as women, that happens. Like, those are the places where speaking up, that's a space, right? Well, didn't such and such just, you know, say the same thing, right?
Yes.
Those are those, and that's a small thing.
No, it can be big though.
Well, it can be big, but just that, you know, that interruption, I think.
Yes.
Little thing. And you can feel it, like, you know it. You're like, And you probably have had maybe colleagues of color, right? You're like, wait a minute, right? You're kind of sitting back. And so I think that's often, that's the litmus for me, like, is if you hear it or you see it and it doesn't feel right, like, you know, something, you're not sure, you can't really pinpoint exactly what it is. That if something's stirring in you, that's the moment to, how you say that and what you say. And I have a very good resource actually on that, about statements that you can use when you hear someone say something that is racist. I have a whole little sheet that I got as a resource, so I can make sure that you have that. But
that would be great.
Yeah,
that would be great, Dr. Smith. Thank you.
I will do that. But something as simple as, can you tell me more about what you meant by that?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Something as simple as that phrase. So it's not threatening to the person who said it. Because in your head, you're thinking, I got something else I can say.
Yeah.
But you're also wanting to use it as an opportunity to maybe engage in a dialogue, because you never know, right? Like, depending on what their answer is, it might be an opportunity to educate, right? It might be an opportunity. They might be open. You never know. But I think just that's a simple phrase. And I'll give you the sheet that has the others, but that's one I've used. And I always say, like, there's a feeling that you get when you know something's just not right.
Absolutely. So, yes, absolutely.
So trust your gut.
Yeah. Well, and it also makes a difference how well I know the person versus a stranger, you know, because I'm going to get in somebody's face if they're a friend or family member, but somebody I don't know as well, I will speak up. But like you said, try to make it be less threatening so they can stop and think. Right.
And how do you have that? I was in an incident just very quickly at a Starbucks last year. And you all are probably familiar with the Black gentleman that went to the Starbucks and they were there for business and ended up getting arrested. It was just this whole craziness. And then Starbucks is now doing implicit bias training. But so I'm in a Starbucks, ironically enough, not too long after that happened. And there's a woman, obviously she was suffering from mental illness. Like there was something that was happening. But I was watching how the staff were engaging with her. And it didn't feel right. And so that was that moment where I saw the manager, I kind of pulled him to the side. I said, you know, did she do something wrong? Or like, cause they were just really they were getting ready to call the police on her and put her out. And, you know, she hadn't been disruptive. She was just kind of sitting to herself. She was talking to herself. Obviously, again, you knew something was going on. But it was, I called them out because I wanted them to recognize, and I didn't say it. And I was like, is there a reason why, or did she do something? I didn't want to say, gotcha. But I also want them to recognize, you know, and stop and pause and think about, like, how are you engaging with this woman right now? And why are you engaging with her like that? Right? This Black woman in the Starbucks, pretty much minding her own business, talking to herself, but minding her own business, right? What's that about? So, example. Anyway, we can keep going.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I know our time is getting short.
And by the way, one of the phrases, you know, we've all heard of mansplaining, everybody. There's also white-splaining. So that's kind of my little phrase. Or
I like that.
Feel free to use that. But we had a question here. I'm going to ask you this question, and you might want to, I think you said there was something else you're going to refer to. When we're talking about this, is it problematical to expand the anti-systemic racism or anti-oppression work to more than just the BIPOC community, women, Muslims, immigrants, Jews? So can we use the same kind of analysis for?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think this extends, right? We talk about oppression, like systemic oppression. Yes, we talk about race, right? And in our work, we center race because there's, you know, any research that you do, right? Race is going to, you know, rise to the top as an indicator about, you know, how folks operate or, you know, sort of navigate a system. But I would say, like, when we talk about oppressed groups, like we can just sit here and sort of name that off. And so I think this work is applicable across the board. So absolutely.
Gosh, let me ask you one other question. I'm going to cheat. Forgive me, you guys out there. How do I talk to my family, my children, my grandchildren about racism and anti-racism?
So there's some really good books that are out now. And I want to say I have a slide that has some resources. I don't think it has children's books on it. I was trying to look at it really quickly. It does not, but there are some books that I think explain. Okay. Yeah, I can follow up with that.
Okay.
I think that's always like literature, and this, of course, the English teacher in me. So literature is always a way in which to connect with young folks, I think. And there's some beautiful illustrations that have been done. So that's one piece. And I would just say, like, kids often know and are aware of a lot more than what we give them credit for. So don't think that they don't know everything that's happening. Because my 5-year-old can tell you we can't go outside because the virus is out there. Like, he talks more about, he berated his sister the other day because she was talking about, I'm going to go to the mall with my friends. And he looked at her, he's like, the mall's not open, it's COVID. I was like, you're so right. Like, you're the smartest one in the car right now.
Yeah.
So it just, 5 years old, right? Like, so kids know. And so I think this being, you know, thinking about, obviously, you know, how you say it, right, is really important. But I think, you know, I'm pretty open and honest with my kids, right, about like what's happening. And I think that's important because they're going to get older, right? And they see things, they hear things. I know Sesame Street has recently did a little series on CNN, both about COVID and about racism. And so Sesame Street and those kind of programs are also doing some things. And I'll make sure to send that because my son had watched the Sesame Street special that's talking about some of that in a way that's kid friendly.
And you said you had some, I don't see any other questions from you guys.
Okay. Yeah. I'll just quickly, there's just one other little slide. Sorry, I'm making you dizzy here. I wanted to share this because I've been talking to people a lot about, like, what is anti-Blackness? We talk about anti-racism. We've also been talking about anti-Black racism. And if you look at this diagram, I got this from a workshop a few months ago, like what is that, right? And basically it's this fear, devaluation, or abuse of Black people. Anti-Black racism is specific, right? It's a specific kind of prejudice against people visibly or who are perceived to be of African descent. And here's the thing, like it's this sort of, it mixes with beliefs about, how people make decisions, how government policies are made, how state services are delivered, and other people of color often also ascribe to anti-Black racism. So at the very bottom of our soil, right, we're just talking about kind of the experience in the United States, that's where we find ourselves. And so I think this is a really good sort of illustration of that. So you can see where anti-Blackness lies, and then all the other stuff that's piled on top of that. And so there's no wonder that there is this narrative and this treatment of Black folks in this country, right, that we have. And so just kind of want to share that we've been talking a lot more about like what anti-Blackness means and what it looks like, how it shows up. So just wanted to put that there. Mm-hmm.
So by anti-Blackness, you're literally saying, someone with Black skin is valued less just because of that, or
just because of the color of their skin. Absolutely.
Lighter skinned is better than darker skin.
Absolutely. And colorism, I didn't even put that up here. That's a whole nother workshop. And that even within the Black community, right? How colorism, and again, that's sort of that's a function of white supremacy. Like it all sort of just goes back into one another. It's this crazy web.
Yes, and it has an impact both on white folk and Black folk. So
absolutely. Yeah. So wanted to share that. Oh, someone has a question.
Well, our book is reading right now, White Fragility.
Oh, yes.
And wow, it's very deep. Unbelievable. I just
love Robin DiAngelo. She's awesome.
Yeah, wow, her writing is so wonderful.
Mm-hmm. I got to hear her speak. I got to hear her speak in person last year, and I think that was the first time I at that conference I heard the word co-conspirator as an alternative to ally, and so I've been using that. So she was wonderful in person as well. If we ever have the opportunity to be in person again, or maybe virtually to see her, she's good. I'm going to skip some of this, but these are just kind of ways of which we decenter whiteness, and I'll make these slides available, Trish, to everybody. Super. These are some of the resources. So if you're looking for some films or some opportunities to kind of engage a little bit more deeply, some of these you may have seen. Netflix, right, has a lot of what you see here, and supporting, Black-owned businesses, Black-led organizations, right? What does that mean? Here's some books, and look at that, White Fragility, right there, number 2, right? Some other ones as well. And when you're thinking about books to choose, this is something to consider. And then there's some podcasts, some really good podcasts. 1619 podcast has gotten a lot of attention. A lot of people don't like that one, but it's got good information. It's some real stuff. So I'll stop with that. And I know we're at our time, so I want to be mindful of that.
I tell you that you didn't really know you were going to do this, and you just pop into this. It's amazing. And, to both you and to the other folks who are on, we're going to be trying to put together a kind of mega bibliography, maybe organized to some degree. Like I'm just reading Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. Oh my God. Great book. I suggest that, guys. But to the extent that, folks here on the, in the presentation, send me or Nancy or even Pat Squire, whomever, here's a book on this topic that I thought was really good, or here's one that our, branch is taking a look at. In particular, because in November, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be asking different branches to make mini presentations about this is what we're doing about this topic, and this is where we want to go with it. So I think we'll be reaching out to the different branches, but be thinking and maybe talking to some other folks in your branches about, you know, kind of taking the temperature of where we are. We're taking the yardstick to see a little bit where we are and where we need to go, et cetera. So I don't know if anyone else has any questions. I just want to thank you so very much for
thank you.
talking. You know, I bet you, you know, I think it's a little past dinner time, but you know, maybe it's a glass of wine, guys, or something like that. But you know, a beer. It's a little late for coffee, but you know, this is gonna get us talking some more. And this is exactly
Good.
And doing, talking, thinking, relearning, and doing.
Good.
So I'm seeing all sorts of stuff. Great presentation.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I would definitely have it available. I've got some notes about some other things to make sure that I get to you. Thank you all. I'm so sorry about my babies.
Perfect.
Never apologize for your kids.
I know, they were lying. Now, of course, they're quiet that I'm done, right? That's how that goes.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Smith. And thank you, everybody else, for being here.
Thank you all. I appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was a great presentation.
Bye-bye.
Considering the difficulties.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Talk to you later, guys. Bibliography.
Great job.
Everyone. Yep. Remember, we'll be communicating. Thanks.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.